So just to reiterate, thank you for coming in this lovely weather, and thank you to Miss Ack again for inviting. So this time I'm doing something quite different, which is kind of experimental, because I hope that something might come out of it, rather than presenting my research as I have done in previous weeks. I hope that this will be a more constructive session in terms of encouraging greater interaction of the Armenian community with various archives and collections in London. I'll focus mainly on the National Archives simply because it's just down the road, but I'll also mention the British Museum, the V&A, and the British Library, all of which have fantastic Armenian texts and objects, and they're waiting for you to discover them. It's sort of aiming to encourage more engagement of various community members, specifically higher shown community members in this case, but perhaps even broader if we open it up to a bigger project. So you all know me, most of you know me from previous talks that I've given here. I'm Alyson Wharton-Durgaryan since I married some time ago, but I've worked historically on Ottoman architecture in the 19th century and the role of Armenian architects in constructing the 19th century Ottoman imperial architecture. So I initially wrote my first book on the Balian family, the famous family of the Dolmabahce Palace, the Çiğran Palace, and all those fantastic palaces in Istanbul. And I've got another book coming out in November on the activities of Armenian architects in the eastern provinces, so in cities like Gaziantep or Aintab, Urfa, Diyarbakir, Bitlis, Mardin, so looking at many different cities in the Ottoman East and comparing the activities of Armenian architects there. Trying to move away from, the Armenian architects were just the Balian family. Anyway, that's my research. Today I am sort of inspired by, let's say, previous encounters where people in the past have come up to me and they've said, I found this in the National Archive. Do you want to sort of take it further? Because they don't have the confidence to do the further research themselves. They found perhaps some pockets of information in the National Archive. They've gone to the National Archive, but they haven't actually had the confidence to develop it into a bigger project themselves, or to publish it in a blog or whatever. So I'm hoping to sort of raise confidence in community researchers to use the National Archives more, and to follow it up with making blogs, with making different kinds of publications, or even for their own enjoyment, just so that more people can use those documents, because at the moment it's still quite restricted in terms of how many people from the Armenian community actually go to the archives or go to the museums and view these things themselves, and have the confidence to take things further themselves. So it's not just the preserve of us historians working in universities to do this work. It's possible for everybody to do it. There shouldn't be any barriers. I thought I'd start by asking who has been to the archives, just out of interest. So I've already had a couple of people, 3, 4. Yeah. Okay, so there's a handful. There's about four people in the room who have been there. Okay, that's good to know. So you may be familiar with some of the things that I'm going to tell you today. Hopefully I'm not going over too much obvious material. So what am I doing today? I'm aiming, as I said before, to sort of develop a project to make archives, make museum collections more accessible, to involve specifically the community here, but perhaps also other communities in London or elsewhere in the UK. As I said before, we'll focus on the National Archive, seeing as it's just down the road, but we can also talk about how to do visits or do sort of workshops that are orientated towards the community, involving other institutions like the British Library or the Victorian Albert Museum. So hopefully at the end of this session I'll ask some questions, we'll have a discussion to try and develop an idea of why people aren't going to the British Library or aren't going to the National Archive or aren't going to the Victoria and Albert Museum. You know, why aren't we making more use of these things that are here? Why don't we know about them? Then hopefully also I'll develop an action plan that might lead into more activities in the future. So we might have more sort of organised sessions where we could invite a curator or something like that, or we could visit together to the archives or to the library and handle objects or go through documents together. But it can also involve things like you know, applications for funding, for digitisation of materials that we have here, or MISAC has here rather, a far-ranging archival materials that you know, require cataloguing and digitisation and putting online to make them more accessible. So there's a range of potential directions that this project could go into, which would perhaps involve placing online the materials that Hayashin has here. But it can also involve consultations with institutions like the National Archive to develop finding aids, which would be like a little document that gives you background about the archival collections and which ones are useful for your particular research interest and how to access those archival collections. It's like a sort of how-to guide to access those archival or museum collections. So you can do a finding aid. You can even do even more sort of far-reaching things like collaborations with archives or with museums to implement new cataloguing systems or new keyword searching systems that will make documents more easy to discover. So I'll talk later about how when I was originally using the National Archives over 10 years ago, you had to search with a very specific spelling of the place that you were looking for. And that spelling was actually the spelling that the consul would use, the British consul would use that spelling, and nobody else would use that spelling. You know, it was a very antiquated 19th century British sort of official spelling of a place in present-day Turkey or Western Armenia. And if you didn't use that precise spelling, then the search results would not bring up the documents that you were looking for about that place. So since then, they've actually changed the keyword searching slightly to incorporate modern Turkish names, but there's obviously potential also to incorporate Armenian names or, you know, people's names as well, with various different spelling combinations too. And there's more sort of metadata and things that you could incorporate also into the search that would bring up more results related to Armenian history. So those are just some ideas that we'll come back to at the end, and I'm hopefully going to get time to ask you some questions about those kind of things and what kind of things would be helpful or would be interesting. I've planned out a session that starts by discussing archives from a sort of academic perspective, as I'm a historian, so I'll give you a bit of background about what is an archive, what are problems with the archive, how do we sort of approach them as historians, what are some of the theoretical perspectives on archives, what are the main problems with archives, particularly in relation to, you know, minority or non-dominant groups, who don't they represent, who's not present in the archive, who's excluded. And then I'll briefly mention how some archives have engaged communities who have been excluded in the past or have been, written about in a derogative way in the archives in the past. How have they tried to sort of give a right to reply to those communities. I'll talk about the National Archive, as I've said before, because it's down the road, so that will be the focus. So I'll take you through some basics about the National Archive and what kind of collections are there, what kind of documents you would see in relation to Armenian history. What are some problems of searching for materials related to Armenian history in the National Archive or elsewhere? How can we try to address some of these problems? And I'll also cover very briefly the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the British Library, because they also, as I've said before, have a lot of material that aren't really being accessed by community members. And then we'll talk about some possible solutions. So, as I said, we'll start by thinking about the archive. What is an archive? There's been a lot of sort of theoretical discussion about archives since the 1990s. People who are sort of big names in history and in sociology and other fields have pontificated for a long time about what archives mean, what's the significance, where do they go back to, what was their purpose. So there's the sort of perception that archives, by ordinary people, not historians, that archives are this sort of mass of material that's not processed, that all these documents from the past just end up in the archive and then we go and discover them, or we go and sort of leaf through them at our own sort of will. But obviously there are lots of processes, and historians have discussed and critiqued these processes in recent years that filter out lots of material before it gets to the archive. So, you know, there are lots of documents that are destroyed, there are documents that are not open to public access, there were you know, documents that were taken to other archives that are not open to ordinary people, that weren't known about until relatively recently. So there are all sorts of situations that ordinary people perhaps do not know about in relation to the history of archives. People like Foucault, for instance, have written since the 1960s that archives are about power. They're about, obviously, collecting information in one place, the information that wants to be collected by the state in order to, you know, keep control over people. And that the origins of the archive actually go back to the Greek city-state. And from the beginning of the history of the archive, there was actually quite a close connection between the archive and public order, and the archive and particularly the courts, the law courts. And that actually continues today because although it's not a sort of, what do you call, a ministerial department, it's still a department of the state. So it still has a pretty close connection with the government today, the archives. And the government gives advice to the archives about what documents should be made available for public safety. So there are certain documents that are not made available, perhaps they pertain to, you know, terrorism or things that might provoke terrorism or something like that. So those kind of documents would be prevented from public access on advice of the government. So there's still a sort of restriction that is determined by what the government views as you know, permissible for the public to access. So there's also this idea that the archives reflect the obsession of Western people, historians in particular, with finding origins and sort of tracing events back to their causes. And so archives have been associated with these kind of historical professions and a need to sort of pinpoint things and to tell things, events and other aspects of history in a chronological, in an empirical fashion to make history clearer and to sort of present history as it was at the time, or so it's viewed to be by empirical historians. So, how are archives formed? Right, so archives go through this process from being a private collection or a sort of a body that's not open to the public to being housed in an archive, and then generally that archive is open to people to use that archive for their research. The definition could be a repository of historical records and information deposited by a certain organisation, people or place. There can be, you know, the church archives like Lambeth Palace, or you'd find, you know, perhaps the Armenian Apostolic Archive in Edgeminton, I'm not sure, but I assume they have a pretty gigantic archive there. But you can also find many sort of private archives that have become public around the UK, including places like William Morris's house in Walthamstow, where they have a wonderful archive of all his letters there. So think about how depth, distance, and sort of this process of depositing are built into the formation of an archive. So there's some time after the death of an individual through which items are assessed, whether they should enter an archive, filtered out. Some things are perhaps destroyed at that point. Not everything makes it to the archive. And then even when it's within the archive, things are selectively opened for the public. Not everything is freely available. You've also got sort of notorious things like the 30-year rule of the National Archive. So after documents have been deposited in the National Archive, you have to wait 30 years after the events have taken place, after those events have passed, before you can access documents on those events. So historians have sort of argued that archives are curated by those who created the archives, those who catalogue the archives, and create the sort of managing systems and searching systems for those archives. And they're also dominated by those who wrote the documents originally. So if we think about the National Archives, for instance, the majority of the documents that you find in the National Archives were written by government servants. So they're very much coming from the perspective of government service and the language of government service. So when you read something like this, which is a British consulate dispatch from Aleppo in 1860, this was written by the British consul who was stationed in Aleppo, and it was sent to the ambassador in Constantinople and then perhaps back to London. So it's very much the voice of the British consul, who was a servant of the state at the time. So it's a very specific angle that it presents on Ottoman life in Aleppo at that time. So the question is, can you get past, through using these documents, can you get past to the view of the consul? Can you view the local interactions and local relations of Aleppo, despite the problems of viewing it through this very official 19th century British perspective at the time? So there are obviously lots of problems with that perspective. There's racism, there's quite strong anti-Armenian language at points. So they weren't always in favour of Armenians. Sometimes they were sympathetic, sometimes they weren't. So there's obviously Orientalism and these kind of aspects. There's also very strong political interests in manipulating the situation of the Ottoman Empire for British advantage. So you have to take into account all of these sort of background things when you're viewing these documents. But people like Laura Stoller advocate reading these kind of documents against the archival grain. So you have to take into account that they come from this very problematic perspective, but at the same time they can still tell you some productive things about Ottoman life at this time, if you appreciate that they are objectifying the people that they're talking about. So, scholars have talked a lot about archival absences and how the history of the archive is a history of loss, that there are so many things that haven't been included, rather than the archive as a history of collecting and preserving things. Actually it's a history of loss, that there's more things that haven't been preserved or have been cast aside for various reasons. In some cases things have been destroyed purposefully, things have been lost due to flooding or other natural disasters, depending on the geography. They have been collected, they have sometimes just survived by chance as well, even they shouldn't have been collected perhaps. So there are many groups of people, and historians are increasingly trying to sort of excavate the traces of people who are not necessarily present in the archive as it was collected. So who has been left out, and how can we try to piece together information about those people who were left out, even though there aren't many documents specifically about them. But we should also think about, what historians do with what they find in the archive too, and how they've also been guilty of leaving out people and been guilty of, writing the stories of the state or of the victorious rather than of the non-dominant populations. And also, the archivists themselves are implicated in situations where it's been so difficult to find documents about Armenians in the Ottoman Empire because of this spelling issue, for instance. So, that may have put off generations of researchers who have gone to the National Archive and tried to find documents. So, one of the most famous cases is, of course, slavery. So historians have drawn attention to the complete lack of voices of slaves in the archives. And they've said that the only things that you can find about slaves in the archive, or enslaved people, is these kind of slave ledgers, which are just numbers. So they just say, there were 5 slaves on a ship, 4 died during the journey, or something like that. And, then there's no names, there's no sort of description of these people. They're just possessions essentially, and so that's the only trace that we have to go on. So historians have tried to turn around even just those numbers, and they've said, what about if we even just change the language that we're using to describe the enslaved people on the ship? And Stephanie Smallwood, for instance, has said, how about we just think about the numbers differently from these ledgers, and we say it's normally understood as the death of 51 enslaved people on a slave ship. Can we just think about it instead as a person was murdered 51 times on the journey, and try to sort of view it on a more individual level rather than objectifying the enslaved person further. So, in addition to these kind of cases of absence, and there are many other absences we could talk about, this is just the most famous example, there are also cases where archival documents have been destroyed, or they've been actively tampered with, that have been very little known until recent work by historians working on the decolonising period of African history. So there were some historians in the 90s to 2000s who were working on Kenyan history. There's a period called the Mau Mau Emergency, which was the period of sort of unravelling of empire. And there were widespread sort of, let's say, clamping down on what were viewed by the British government to be insurgent movements. So this involved torture, murder, other kinds of, extreme violence or extreme sort of abuse. So a lot of these documents so these activities were known to have happened by researchers, whether because of oral histories or other things that were passed down. So some researchers went to the National Archives to try and find documents about these things to prove that they happened. But they couldn't find them, but instead they started to find holes in the archives, that there was one official who was referring to another official, but actually there was no evidence of that other official. So there were clear holes that were in the archives. And then another historian who happened to be working in another archive called Hanslope Park in Milton Keynes discovered that there were actually documents there about Kenya. So it turned out that a huge chunk of the archival documents from the National Archive got sent to this site in Milton Keynes, which very few people actually knew about until after a Freedom of Information request in 2005 by these historians. So this resulted in what was called the Hanslope Disclosure, which was the discovery in 2011 of a huge amount of documentation that had been sent to this site in Milton Keynes. 300 boxes, 1,500 files, 110 feet of records from the FCO. And they were all about the different colonies and the period of this unravelling of empire, where there was widespread atrocities against indigenous populations and supposed insurgents. And these spanned various different colonies, not just Kenya, but also other places like Malaysia, India, and so on. And it turned out that this documentation was packed up from the colonies and taken directly to this site in Milton Keynes. And these were particularly the kind of documents that might embarrass HMG or other governments, members of the police, military forces, and so on. So this was a clear case of the deliberate removal of a large chunk of archival documents. So I'm sure I don't need to explain the case of the Ottoman archives to you because you're an Armenian audience. But in the Ottoman archives, there are clear, gaps in the archives. There are collections that are not open to researchers. There are, for instance, the land registry documents that have not been open to people like Umit Kurt, who have done their research on Antep or Aintab. So researchers do encounter, concrete cases of archival collections in Turkey that are not accessible. In addition to that, there's the official publications that have been being produced since the 1970s at least, like this one by Esat Rus, which are sort of manipulating archival evidence in order to create an argument about the lack of genocide and the provocation of the Ottoman Armenians and the rise of the Armenian revolutionary parties, serving as a fifth column, serving as a threat to the Ottoman Empire. And they're being deported, not murdered, but sent somewhere else instead of genocide, through selective using of these Ottoman documents. So that's two ways in which the Ottoman archives have been manipulated. So number one, there's document collections that aren't open. Number two, there's selective publication of Ottoman documents that show the official argument about there not being a genocide. So, and those publications are often produced by people who are connected to the archives, whether they're the archive director or other state servants. So this is a very clear case of the proximity of the archive to the government again. But I have to say that during the course of my experience in the Ottoman archives, I've been working there for over a decade, and over the course of that time, things have improved. It was certainly a lot more tense in the early sort of 2000s, early 2010s than it is now. There are a lot more sort of openly Armenian researchers who are researching there. In the old days, you had to be quite selective and quite sort of secretive about what you were requesting, and if you requested anything that was political, then it would perhaps not get delivered to you. Whereas now, there seems to be a lot more freedom in terms of the archive slightly opening up, at least on subjects that aren't very controversial ones, like the land registry ones, which are still firmly closed. So although there's some opening up, there's still some subjects that are absolutely closed. So, but we should also mention that in the UK, we're not completely without fault as well. There are also cases of documents that I've come across. I've been researching Ottoman Armenian craftsmen and painters and creative actors in the 19th century, and I've come across examples where documents about them have been destroyed. So I've searched in the Victorian Albert Museum for records of artworks that I know were offered to the museum for purchase, and commissions that were offered by this artist to the Victorian Albert Museum. And I found references to them in the archives, but the documents themselves have been destroyed. So again, that shows, that there is a filtering out process that takes place that has viewed these Armenian cultural actors as not significant enough to, retain the documents that pertain to their activities. So they've been filtered out of the history of the Victorian Albert Museum through the activities of the archivists, essentially. So a lot of the sort of discussion of working in the archives reflects in a kind of pompous way about how much pressure it is to work in the archives. So you have, this very hard work of spending all day breathing in the dust of the documents and reading about all the lives of these people who were in times long ago, and how you go back to your hotel room at night, you can't sleep because you have all these stories of people and their voices in your head, in your hotel room. And you have these worries that as a historian you can't do these people of the past justice. You'll never get through all of the archival documents. I thought, if you turn this around and view it from a sort of community perspective, an Armenian community's perspective, it's completely different. And these struggles of the historian about, not getting through the documents or not doing the people of the archives or of the past justice, it completely changes if you think about, the positionality of an Armenian community researcher using the archives, and it's completely detached from this situation of doing the historical actors justice, and it's much more concerned with sort of trauma and, how can you even use the archive if it is created by a government or, a situation that is trying to erase your people. So how do you even sort of go there and encounter these documents that have these negative portrayals or have these sort of built-in systems that have tried to act against what you're trying to do in the archives. So some historians have started to discuss this, particularly from a black perspective. Some people have said, the experience of using the National Archives in the United States is quite oppressive, quite traumatic, because the state archives are surrounded with these sort of Confederate statues and this very sort of nationalistic American imagery. So it's difficult for black American researchers to sort of go into these buildings and to be comfortable. And similarly, if you look to this room here, which is the Asian and African Studies reading room in the British Library. And you can see, you can see right at the back of the room there is actually the East India Company coat of arms that's hanging up in the room. And the walls are lined with all these paintings of colonial figures. And even for me as a researcher who's working on Islamic art generally in the Ottoman Empire, these paintings and these images are jarring. So imagine what it must feel like if you're an Indian historian who's working on the independence movement or something, and you're surrounded by this imagery. It must be a very different experience. So institutions have started to sort of acknowledge this recently. And some institutions have something like this, which is an anti-racist statement, and they put it up on their website. So this is a way that they've started to sort of acknowledge the difficult situations of researchers who may be from communities that have been the victims of oppression or erasure. And it says
things like the Getty Research Institute is committed to addressing biased language, distortion and the erasure of marginalised individuals and communities in the description of our collections. And there's a bit that's about sort of racist language, and many of these things are trying to sort of deal with the problem of racist language. So they don't want to destroy the documents. They don't want to get rid of the historical evidence because it's a product of that time, but at the same time, they need to put a statement like this so that people can have perspective on that language and sort of view it as something that should not be encouraged in the present day. So there's also the issue of not just the experience of using these archives and the imagery of the archives and the language of the archives that you might encounter. There's also the problem of the archivists themselves, and this is a survey of the sort of racial origins of archival workforces in the UK, and 96.7% of the workforce identified as white compared to 87.5% identifying as white in 2015. So, oh yeah, sorry, I need to clarify that. So the first statistic is within the library. So it's 96.7 library archives staff are white. So even though, you know, obviously in the UK there's already a massive sort of majority of people identifying as white, this is particularly pronounced in archives, where it's 96.7% of archival workforce is white.
Invest, save, and spend.
So there's been, because of all the archival absences that I mentioned, there's been a movement to try and incorporate more sort of community perspectives within the archives. Historically, Indigenous knowledge has been viewed as a sort of opposite to archives, because archives have been viewed to be a sort of institution where documents are collected by a government or another organisation, and they're sort of, you know, these physical spaces. In contrast, Indigenous knowledge is something that is sort of passed down through communities, not necessarily written down, not necessarily preserved on paper or in a building. But some scholars have started to argue that actually, like Lynette Russell, they've started to argue that the information in archives and libraries can be viewed as Indigenous knowledge if we view it critically. So we can revisit perhaps some of the documents in archives and sort of reclaim it for Indigenous communities. And there's also a lot of other work going on in terms of assembling alternate archives, like the Humanities website, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is a huge collection of oral histories and objects and Armenian language texts that are all about the different localities of the Ottoman Empire, where Armenians once lived, or Western Armenia. So this is an example of the sort of tension between the archive and Indigenous knowledge, which is given by Professor Lynette Russell, who's a specialist on Aboriginal populations in Australia. And she describes doing research about her great-grandmother called Emily. And she says that her great-grandmother was institutionalised in an asylum in Australia because she was experiencing auditory hallucinations. These hallucinations turned out to be actually part of her Indigenous beliefs and part of her, you know, hearing the sort of the noises of the spirits, essentially. But they were interpreted by medical professionals at the time as her insanity. So she was put into an asylum, and she was given, you know, extreme treatments at the time. This is going back, over 50 years ago, so the treatments then were quite radically different from what they are now. So she describes this situation of reading these treatments that her great-grandmother was subjected to, and how she was thinking that she didn't perhaps want these to be accessible to other people, to read about her great-grandmother going through all of this. Even though all documents in the archives in Australia would have been, in theory, open to outside researchers after 100 years after the events. And so Professor Russell describes that in some cases there's a growing sort of movement to destroy these kind of records from Aboriginal communities so that other people can't have this sort of voyeuristic, let's say, insight into the hardships that they went through. And another idea is that archives have worked with Aboriginal communities to develop a policy document that sort of breaks down what the access to these different documents might be with the consent of the community. And they've also discussed a right to reply. So could the Aboriginal community add their own sort of comment on the situation, or their additional documentation on the situation to shed more light on what was happening and to sort of speak back to the official archive somehow. So that's another thing that some archives have been looking into. So I was thinking, how would a right to reply work in the Armenian case? So you could perhaps insert links to indigenous sources about the places that are discussed in the National Archive. You could put a link to Humanities or other sort of oral histories about Western Armenia. You could add notes somehow to the places in the archival documents where racist language appears, or you could add, a statement on the archival website that would cover all of the documents, like most archives have done. You could limit access, as the Aboriginal community have argued in Australia, to atrocity descriptions, particularly if they involve, members of family or something like that. Also, organisations like the National Archive have brought together focus groups. They had a workshop that you can see on the website there, which is on the topic of racism, past and present. And they gathered together a focus group of people from diverse communities to discuss the history of the British black community from the sort of 1930s to the present day. And they had with that focus group a psychologist and also an art therapist, and I think maybe a poet or something as well. And they had an idea that this focus group could revisit documents from a traumatic past, involving obviously discrimination of the British black community, as long as it was in what they called a psychologically safe environment, so that participants can share the impact that these records have of them, and also so that the participants can create something as a part of the process, whether a piece of writing, a piece of poetry or artwork or something like that. So that has helped communities to sort of revisit the archival record and sort of work through it with psychological and sort of creative assistance. So I'll briefly sort of speed through the National Archives itself. It's interesting that on the website, I'm not sure many of you have looked at the website because it's just down the road. It's not actually that easy to find the history on the website because there's all these other more interesting things that the National Archives wants you to read. The different departments of the state. You also had the key point in 1958 where you had the Public Records Act, where tons of documents were destroyed and were filtered out and this was a key moment in, the self-censorship of the archives and selective purging and retaining of documents. You have the building in Kew, which was built in 1977, and only in 2003 there were a couple of different groups that merged together that gave it the name the National Archives. So most of the documents are government departments, as I mentioned. You can also find things like court documents. You can find a lot of information if you're looking for a particular person. So you can find things like naturalisation, census records, military service, wills, medals, patents, things like that can help you learn about an individual. But there is the spelling problem, and sometimes Armenian names don't always show up. So, and the search isn't very flexible in terms of recognising different spellings. So, what do you do when you get there? You walk into the entrance past the cafe. You register for a reader's ticket, so I think you just need ID to register for the ticket. It's very straightforward. Then you go to this room where you use the computer catalogues to start to search for documents, and you order documents through these computers. And you can order also remotely on your own computer at home. So after you've ordered a document, you go through to the reading room, and you go to the desk at the reading room and you give them your reader card, and then they go into the shelves and they retrieve the documents for you. So you don't browse the shelves. You just use this catalogue. This is the catalogue. You put in your keyword. So it might be a name, it might be a place, and then it displays the results. And then you order your documents on these computers. You go into the reading room here. You order the documents. You take the reader card and they bring you the documents, and then you sit down at the table and read them. Okay, so one of the main collections that you would find information about Armenians is the Foreign Office documentation. And this depends on actually if you're searching for UK Armenians or not. I should have said at the start, my expertise is mainly on the Ottoman Empire, so I've used the archives primarily to find out about Western Armenia or Ottoman Empire or Turkey. So for that case, I use the Foreign Office documentation, FO or FCO as it's now called, and they have all of these country codes. So the Foreign Office documentation spans all these different countries. Turkey is here, number 44. And this is the documentation from 1906 to 1919, where they have a huge amount of British consuls in various locations around the world. So you can find out actually quite a lot about all these different locations in that period in the early 20th century. There's also here Caucasus from 1918, so there was a British consul in the Caucasus, so that would be worth also for researching about Armenians. Egypt, various other places where there were Armenian populations, but the main one is Turkey. So what you can find for Turkey or Western Armenia includes the embassy reports from Constantinople, consular reports. So the consuls were stationed at various different cities through what is now Turkey or Western Armenia, as it was. You can also find a lot of documentation about peace conferences and the behind-the-scenes negotiations related to that. These are some examples when you put in the name Diyarbakir. You can have this report from 1855 from the consul at Diyarbakir, or correspondence between the ambassador and the consul in Diyarbakir. So most of it is descriptions of the consuls who are based in Anatolia or Western Armenia at the time, who are sending their reflections to the ambassador in Constantinople. There's also a lot on Indian Armenians, and I think this is really interesting because it kind of reflects actually in some ways the proximity of Indian Armenians to the government, because nearly all the documents on Indian Armenians are not in the National Archives in Kew, but in the British Library, and that's where the East India Company documentation is. So that's the Indian Office Library, or the Indian Office records. So those are kept at the British Library, and there you can find detailed information about Armenians in India. So that includes documentation about the church, documentation about individual Armenian merchants and their wills. So it's much more detailed than we have for the Ottoman Armenians, where you just have, relatively brief descriptions of Armenians who were living in the areas where the consuls were stationed. In India, you actually have quite detailed information about the communities. I'm not sure, it's interesting to see what the documentation would be about Iran. So I'm not sure, I don't think that Iran was on the list here. And I've never investigated what is available in the Foreign Office documentation on Iran. So I would assume that it wouldn't be as detailed as India, where there was a substantial British presence and Armenians were working in collaboration with the government in some ways. So, as I mentioned before, there have been some changes already in terms of accessibility. So, since I started working in the archives, they've now implemented modern spellings. So now they have the old spelling of the consul from the 19th century, Mush, M-U-O-M-O-U-S-H, but they also have the modern Turkish spelling of M-U-S, or the modern spelling of Erzurum, you can see there as well, or Diyarbakir. So this is an area I was thinking about, perhaps we could do something there in terms of putting Armenian place names in some cases, although most Armenians, if not all Armenians, would know the modern Turkish names, but nevertheless, if it's a matter of sort of reinserting Armenian history into the archives, then it would be good to have Armenian names too. So a main way that the archives have focused on accessibility is through digitising. So you can access 9,000 documents online. But sadly for us, most of these are the most requested documents, so they're not necessarily ones that are of interest for Armenians. So they tend to be things like medals or naturalisation or census records. So you're not going to have the Foreign Office documentation, for instance, accessible online. You have to go physically to the archives to access it. In contrast, if you go to the British Library website, they've got a lot of their materials now on their website. So they have a website called Images Online, and they have the majority of the visuals from the Indian Office collections, including a lot of documents and photographs of Armenians in India that are freely accessible on their website. And it covers a different kind of, range of things, from maps to photographs to paintings to illuminated manuscripts. So a mixed kind of selection of objects and textual materials that you can find in the British Library collections. They also have this Endangered Archives programme where they've digitised Armenian manuscripts. So if you go to the British Library website, the Endangered Archives programme, there's all of these manuscripts that are fully digitised that you can click on and read and download. In terms of what else is available at the British Library, you also have a large collection of Armenian books, which perhaps you might not be aware of, including quite a few of the memory books, or Hushamadian. So mainly these Hushamadian ones are associated with the libraries in the US, where you have the the National Association for Armenian Studies in Boston, where they have a big library of memory books. But actually the British Library has quite a good collection of memory books. So it's worth going there, registering for a reader card and ordering these books too, because they've got this fantastic memory book on Urfa, for instance. They've got the one on Diyarbakir by, I can't remember his name, but they've got actually a very rich collection of memory books there that you can go and read that aren't available elsewhere in the UK, perhaps in Oxford, but anyway, this is a rich collection. And there's no barriers to going there. You just take ID, you get a reader card. You have to order the books in advance if you don't want to wait for them. But you know, you can go there, you can read those books in the reading room. You can't take the books home, but you have to sit in the reading room. But apart from that, there aren't any barriers. Here, the V&A. The V&A has gone flat out in digitising its artworks the past year. I was using the V&A website only 1 year ago, and they have a tiny fraction of the things that they've now got on the website. So now, I think they've nearly digitised all of their collections, because the Armenian objects are now totalling 2,689 objects that you can view on the V&A website, which is actually a really huge collection of Armenian art. And I think nobody actually realises that there are that many Armenian art objects in the Victoria and Albert Museum, because the trouble is with the V&A, it's never had a curator of Armenian art. So it's never had a full-time staff member who's looking after the Armenian objects. It's always just had a keeper of the Middle East section. And the keeper of the Middle East section tends to be a specialist in Islamic art. And they tend to know Arabic or Persian. They won't know Armenian language, and they won't even know, what the objects are they're dealing with. So a lot of the time, the keepers at the Victoria and Albert Museum, or the curators, have to employ outside advisors to help them to catalogue the collection and to understand, what these objects are, because they don't necessarily have a grounding in Armenian art and they don't have the language. So there's actually a huge amount of work that could be done in going through these objects and identifying, in many cases, what they are. These are the ones that are on public display, so there are 46 objects on public display that are Armenian ones. But there are many, many more in storage, huge amount in storage. And you can view them all through clicking that link, and they range from these are just two examples. This is a more luxurious example, which is the Isfahan cope. It was donated to the V&A Museum by an Armenian dealer called Injujian, or there were two brothers called the Injujian brothers, and they donated this cope to the museum. And until relatively recently, they didn't actually know what it was. They didn't realise how important this cope was, and it turned out that it was actually the cope of one of the highest priests in the Armenian church hierarchy. So, and it's thanks to outside advice that this was identified, and it had sat in the museum for nearly a century without being identified. But it was thanks to an Armenian scholar who identified what this was, who gave it the context and published a couple of articles about it. But there are also more, let's say, ordinary everyday objects, like this skull cap, which was coming from the previous collection of a colonial official who was based in Tehran and collected it and then gave it to the museum, so it came through that route. And that seems a more sort of everyday object, but nevertheless, it just shows you the huge variety of things that they have there. The British Museum you're more familiar with, I'm sure, because of all this recent publicity for the loan of the Anahit sculpture to the History Museum in Yerevan. Of course, the British Museum has long been notorious for Armenians because of its lack of recognition for Armenian objects. And so it seems to be as a sort of mea culpa in a way that they agreed to do this loan to Armenia, to send the Anahit sculpture there and to recognise finally that it is of significance for Armenian heritage. But even in the British Museum, they're also starting to identify more and more objects as Armenian. So there are 697 items on their website that are described as Armenian. And some of those involve things that would previously perhaps be displayed as Islamic, like Kütahya ceramics and things like that. So we're starting to see how curators are more and more including, objects that would previously be catalogued in a different way as Armenian, and sort of recognising their Armenianness, which is interesting. So just to sort of finish up with the National Archives and the documents. So we were mentioning before that, if you go to the archives and you read all these consular documents, you may come across things that are, problematic or objectionable or perhaps even traumatic. This is an example of the objectification of Armenian populations that you'll see, all the time in this kind of documentation. So it talks about an attack on the Armenian community in Dehe, which is a village near to Diyarbakir, and it's a report on, atrocities essentially in this village. And it's very common to just see, a line saying, they violated all the women without exception in the village or something like that. So it's very common to have no more detail than, very brief mentions of what happened. So you have to come across those kind of things quite often. You also come across things like views of Armenians as insurrectionists or propagandists, stirring up problems. So this is quite a common thing, common accusation of the consuls. Here they say, it appears to me that the Armenians are to some extent responsible in sustaining, as they do even in quiet times, a constant state of unrest and suspicion in their minds of their Turkish rulers by the continued publication in Europe of the often exaggerated and frequently quite unfounded charges of outrage upon this government. So it's sort of, a typical complaint that Armenians are stirring things up, basically. You see these kind of comments very frequently by the consuls. And what's really amazing about this page is that it's a very long page criticising Armenians and their activities in Europe, stirring things up. And then the person who's read this, who's presumably the ambassador, has annotated it in pencil there as well and highlighted it. And he's added, "It's a pity this cannot be published." So it's just, it's quite, it strikes really of a sort of gentleman's club that, within the Foreign Office service, there was this, far-reaching assumption that Armenians were just trouble, basically. So it's just, they're always going, "No, yes, not again," sort of thing. Other examples of bad Armenians. So it's very, very common to have a description of, like an Armenian tax collector here, Garabed, who's beating his fellow Armenians. Political murders that take place of Armenians who are working on behalf of the Ottoman state, or slander here of rich Armenians of Sivas who are not giving any money to help the poorer compatriots, and even criticising poor inhabitants who are living close to their mansions. So yes, you become very accustomed to these sort of very snobby official descriptions of Armenians. So, potential problems of using these things as an Armenian are frustration that you can't find what you're looking for because it doesn't show up in the keyword search and you can't read the handwriting. Discomfort created by the difference between perhaps memory of Ottoman life or Armenian life in those places that's passed down from families or from generations. Difference between those memories and what you see in the archives, so what kind of dissonance might that create, or sort of trauma. Frustration that even named figures are dealt with very briefly, so you might finally find that family relation, but he only has one very brief sentence about him, even though he was a very important person in Diyarbakir in 1860 or whatever. Frustration at those racist attitudes we just saw of the consuls. And also it's very frustrating that you know that the massacres are coming, the genocide's coming, and you can see reading those documents that things are unraveling, and not enough is being done to prevent this. So all of these things can create some discomfort when using these documents, and I imagine even more discomfort if you're a descendant of these people who are being objectified or being mistreated or worse. I was going to mention, actually, because you have some Zabel Boyajian materials here, that Zabel Boyajian's father, Thomas Boyajian, he was quite an important figure in Diyarbakir, and he has quite a presence, actually, in the National Archives, because he was also the assistant consul. He was like the translator for the consul, and he served quite an important relation or role in relation to the consul. So for that reason, because he was close to the consul, he appears quite a lot in the correspondence. So for some people you can find a lot, but others are just a figure or a sort of disparaging, objectified comment. What can you get out of it? So I would encourage you to go, because you get such a view of the texture of Ottoman life and Armenian life in those cities, despite the racism, despite the discomfort of all of those aspects that I described. It still is a wonderful experience to learn about those localities up close and to view those relationships. And I would say that the positive encounters between communities in the main outweigh the instances of the massacres. So it's quite interesting to sort of get past the histories that have been published that have focused on the genocide or have focused on the massacres, and to sort of go back in time to try and look at perhaps more positive memories behind, or positive instances of interactions before that. And they should be read in combination with things like the memory books as well. We mentioned at the start, we can digitise Hayashen's collection, hopefully, and that would be a priority. And there are funds available from the National Archives that you can apply to for these kind of things, so that would definitely be a priority. You can do things like provide information about resources in London for researching Armenian history. So you could add, for instance, on the Hayashen website or another website, information about, how to go about this, what contacts there are. Because we're actually very lucky that both at the British Library and at the V&A, there are very pro-Armenian staff members there. And in fact, I'm sure, if we approach them, then they would be happy to come and talk to you in a lot more detail about what they have, because they're very interested in encouraging more involvement of communities. So that would be an idea, or we could even go there and visit some objects and things like that together. That would be something that might be possible to arrange. Things like, we could go to the National Archives together, take you through all the processes of ordering the documents and help with those kind of things to make that easier. You can also do things like work with the National Archives to change things like the keyword searches and what kind of things do appear on the search. Do they accommodate different spellings? Do they accommodate different place names, or variations on people's names that researchers might be inputting into the computers? And my husband is a computer developer, and he's always complaining about the standard of website developers that are used in UK institutions, and he says that they always, they don't have very good search systems, and if only they, did more investment or did involve people who really were at the top of, that industry, then these searches would work better, and perhaps there wouldn't be all these cyber attacks and things that would make everything fall. Like the British Library's catalogue has been out for God knows how long. So anyway, these are some ideas. Also the right to reply idea. What would a right to reply consist of? Are there any ideas about that kind of thing too? You could also do more exhibitions and things. You know, has there ever been an exhibition on Armenians in the UK in the National Archives? Probably not. I don't think we're ever going to see a big exhibition like they had at the Metropolitan Museum on Armenia in the UK, because we don't have the big money that Armenian donors have in America. But there is an exhibition coming up that's an exhibition on the Ottoman Empire, and that will involve display of Armenian objects for the first time as part of the Ottoman Empire. So that is quite a big step. Given that nearly all of the exhibitions on the Ottoman Empire in the UK in the past have been very much from a Turkish, nationalist perspective. So already things are changing, and I think there's, although we might not have a giant Armenia exhibition like the US, we can still do something and make some changes in the way that things are displayed and catalogued and, digitised and things like that. So that's it.